Hello everyone, this is Luke from Expert Aviator, and today I'm back with another S3 tutorial for you on identification, validation and verification, which is commonly abbreviated to IVV. As always, this tutorial is for people who are training for their S3 in the UK, or people who are waiting for training for their S3 in the UK. It is based off the VAT UK syllabus, however it should really be applicable to anybody. As always, a disclaimer before we start, this isn't endorsed at all by VAT UK, so there may be some mistakes. If there are, then please do let us know in the comments, or equally if you have any questions, let us know and we'll get back to you. So in this video today, we're going to look at identification. We're going to focus on what it actually is, the primary surveillance radar methods of identifying, and the secondary surveillance radar methods. If you're not sure on what PSR and SSR are, watch our previous video. We're then going to go into validation, what it is and its methods, the same with verification, and then we'll apply all that practically by looking at dealing with departures. So identification, what is it? Identification is the process of working out which blip is which aircraft. So when you've probably been on tower, your correlation mode on Euroscope has likely been set to easy VATSIM. If you're not sure what that is, don't worry, that will be explained in another video. But what happens with easy VATSIM is basically, regardless of whether the aircraft is actually identified or not, the call sign of the aircraft is always shown next to the blip. That's fine, but it's not really realistic, and that's not how radar works at all. So when you move up to S3, we're going to encourage you to use the C mode correlation, which actually helps you to understand this topic better. Now what happens there is if the aircraft isn't identified, then all you see is a squawk code and their level. You don't know who it is. We call that an uncorrelated tag or an uncorrelated aircraft. Now when you see a call sign next to the blip, because you know who that blip is, that's when the aircraft is correlated. So you can see my screenshots there. The first screenshot, all you see is a squawk, 0001, and the aircraft's level, so flight level 100. So all we know there is we know that it is an aircraft squawking 0001 at flight level 100, but we don't know who it is. So that's an uncorrelated aircraft. Now if you look at the second screenshot, we can see that that aircraft is Chinook 686. At flight level 110, cleared to flight level 340. So we know who that is, and we have some more data on him. So that's a correlated aircraft. Basically, in other words, identification is making the uncorrelated aircraft into correlated aircraft. So there are 6 identification methods, 3 primary surveillance radar methods and 3 secondary surveillance radar methods. So looking at the primary surveillance radar methods, the first one is a turn method. With the turn method, you ask the aircraft to report their heading, and you then instruct them to fly a new heading that's at least 30 degrees different to what they've just reported. You watch the screen and observe that they are flying the correct heading, and when you are happy that they're flying the correct heading and you know who this aircraft is, you have then identified them. That's all the turn method does. Moving on to the position report method, it's where you identify a pilot when they report either overhead of VRP or on a VOR radial with an associated DME. The pilot cannot be more than 3,000 feet above the VRP, or it's deemed to be too inaccurate. And if it's from a VOR, the pilot must be within 30 miles of the VOR. And the VOR and or the VRP have to be shown on your screen to be used for identification. The other PSR method is a departure method. So this is what I know Manchester use this real world. I'm not sure about other aerodromes. We don't tend to use it on VATSIM at the moment. But basically what happens is the tower will pass an airborne time to the departure controller. The departure controller will then find the blip that will appear within 1 mile at the end of the active runway. And basically because the blips appeared at that time, they know who it's going to be, because the tower controller's just told them. So therefore they've identified the aircraft. The problem with the departure method is that you can get things going over the top of the aerodrome, so anything that could be like birds, but also say a VFR transit that's going over the top, or even an IFR transit that's at flight level 350. If that shows on the radar, that could be going over the top of the aerodrome, and the blips could go together, so there is a chance for confusion there. So let's move on to the SSR methods. The first one is validation of previously identified data. So that's when another controller has identified an aircraft, and when they hand you that aircraft, they're also transferring the identity. So that's the reason when you're flying, let's say you're with London, London identifies you. When you're transferred to either the next London controller or to your respective radar unit, they don't give you a new squawk code, or they don't re-identify you, because that identity's been passed by London already. Another method is a squawk change. So it's when you assign a new unique squawk, and unique is important. It has to be a unique code. By you watching the pilot change and that pilot actually change into that code, they're going to be the only pilot within your radar region change into that code. So therefore you know it's them. And lastly, we have ident. So this is probably the most common one on VATSIM. It's when it displays a flash on your screen. So all squawk codes can be idented except 7000. That's the only code that cannot be idented. It's not recommended to ident a listening or a conspicuity code. However, you can do it. So it's better that you use another identification method, but you could ident them if you need to. An example of a listening squawk would be 7366 at Manchester, and an example of a conspicuity code would be 5050 at Liverpool. They are slightly different, but in this video we're not going to go into the difference between them. As you can see in the screenshot at the bottom, I've shown you a normal tag and an aircraft that's identing. So the star is just a Mode C target that's shown up. So you can see at the bottom, Chenex 686, he's just a normal target. You can see Chenex 50 Zulu Golf towards the top of the screenshot. He has a circle around his star, which is the ident feature being activated on his transponder. So this table is really important. You just have to learn it. It basically tells you when to tell the pilot they're identified and when to give the pilot their position. So the Europeans and other countries tend to say radar contact or identified a lot. In the UK, we don't do it very often. We only do it when this table tells us to. So if you identify a pilot via any method inside controlled airspace, the only one you tell them that they're identified is via the turn method. Likewise, it's the same with the position. Now, outside controlled airspace, you tell them they're identified whenever you use any method at all, but you only tell them their position when you use a turn method. The position is a real logical one. The turn method is the only method you've used to actually turn them off their own navigation. So therefore, you're telling them where they now are, so that they aren't lost. But the other method, you haven't turned them off, so there's no need to tell them their position. So that's identification. Let's move on to validation. So validation is the process of checking that the pilot is squawking the code assigned to them. Whenever an aircraft is identified, it's also validated. So the two kind of go together, but they are separate things. To validate an aircraft, you can use any of the identification methods. Now, whoever instructs the aircraft to squawk the code should validate it, but on VATSIM this isn't always the case. So if Tower tells the departure to squawk a code, they should validate that aircraft and check that it's actually squawking the code. We don't train our tower controllers to do this, so the basically S3s and above always do it. So that's the reason you'll always be told to ident on departure on VATSIM. So that's validation done. Let's move on to verification. So verification is the process of checking that the Mode C readout is correct. Again, if you're not sure what Mode C means, go and check our previous video on PSR and SSR. So the Mode C data must be verified when an aircraft departs. This is done by saying report your level. So speedbird 123, report your level. From whatever altitude or flight level the aircraft reports, the figure on the screen must be within plus or minus 200 feet from the reported value. So if they report 2,400 feet and the number on your screen is between 2,200 and 2,600, then that aircraft is verified. If it's outside those parameters, then the aircraft isn't verified and you have to re-verify them through another report. Some more points on Mode C data while we're here. An aircraft is considered to have left a flight level or an altitude when their Mode C is plus or minus 400 feet and continuing. So let's say an aircraft's at flight level 70, they start a descent. When they're passing flight level 66 and continuing down, flight level 70 is deemed to be vacated. And finally, 3 successive Mode C readouts of plus or minus 200 feet indicate level flight. So that's identification, validation and verification done. So the only thing we've got to do is apply this practically now to dealing with departures. So in the UK, we're quite different to other places. most of the time the radar controller doesn't actually handle departures, just because of the way our airspace is designed. So the majority of the time, departures will go straight to the area controller. Now, of course, on VATSIM, sometimes we don't have the area controller, so you'll have to handle them as the radar controller, or sometimes, places like East Midlands, for example, on 09, all departures go to the radar controller, irrespective of who's online, because of the way the airspace is. Again, consult with local VMATs for that. But the key thing, sometimes you will have to deal with departures as the radar controller. So what you have to do, you first have to validate the aircraft, you then verify the aircraft, and then issue a suitable climb instruction. So, as I mentioned before, the most common kind of form of validation and identification is the ident feature. So, let's just take an RT example to explain this. Let's just say Easy123 is climbing out of Manchester, just for the sake of it, we'll say he's a Samba 1 Romeo departure. So, he calls Manchester Radar, he says, Manchester Radar, Easy123 climbing to altitude 5,000 feet. Now, we have to first validate, verify, and then issue a climb. So Easy123, Manchester Radar, squawk ident, that's the validate bit, and report your passing altitude or report your level. Either of those two phrases are acceptable. That is where you're verifying the aircraft. So the aircraft will now say, passing 2,300 feet, Easy123. Easy123, roger. So you've now you've verified the aircraft. It's important not to get these two terms mixed up. So that's where you're verifying the aircraft. And now you're on to step 3, where you issue a suitable climb instruction. So climb now, flight level 150. Now I've underlined climb now because we're going to explain briefly what that RT is. So in the UK, we have climb and climb now, the same way we have descend and descend now. So as per Cap 413, you would always say climb, and the only time you would say climb now is if a conflict exists. So you want the aircraft to climb immediately. However, we've adopted, whether it be in the EASA or an ICAO procedure, basically from the rest of the world, we've adopted that into our RT, where we say climb now to cancel any vertical profile restriction, and we say climb to just let the aircraft climb as they want to. So, the only time we ever actually use climb now in the UK is to climb an aircraft off a SID. So with a SID, there is a defined profile, which may well level off at certain bits. So if an aircraft comes to you on the SID, and you say climb flight level 190, the aircraft should actually maintain 5,000 feet until they, or whatever the initial altitude is, until they reach the end of the SID, then climb to flight level 190. If you say climb now flight level 190, you're telling the aircraft to ignore the SID and initiate the climb straight away. So after you've issued one climb now, the rest of the instructions will just be climb. So let's move on to another example just to reinforce this dealing with departure situation. So an aircraft calls up, and this time they report what they're actually meant to. So Manchester Radar, Easy123, passing at 2,300 feet for 5,000. Easy123, Manchester Radar, squawk ident. So again, you're validating the aircraft. Now the next step, remember, is to verify the aircraft. Now, the aircraft's already told us their passing altitude, so we don't have to ask them for it again. So because they've already told us, we just check that it's within the plus or minus 200 feet parameters. If it is, we've also verified them, so then the last step is to issue them a climb. So again, climb now, flight level 150. The aircraft will read that back, climb now, flight level 150, Easy123. So as you can see, I'll just switch back to the previous slide. You've got 4 transmissions there. And they've only got 3. So if the pilot reports a passing altitude like they're meant to, you end up with less RT, but sometimes they don't, so you may need an extra transmission. I will just point out here that you can't have an instruction to squawk ident, an instruction to climb, and a report your level or report your passing altitude. So you only have a few combinations, and it's just because these are kind of special instructions. So you can either have an ident and a climb, an ident and a report your passing level, or a report your passing level and a climb, but you can't have all 3 together. So this will make a lot more sense when you actually do it practically, but hopefully it's given you enough of a base knowledge to be able to understand what the documents are saying and give you a head start in your radar training. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.